Okay, computer says it's working. All right, so I know this may sound out of place, but how do you end a conversation you want to get out of? I'm not trying to say anybody here wants to leave the room, but you get to the end of you get to the middle of a conversation and you really would like to wrap things up and leave. How do you do that politely? All right, we all know how to do it rudely, which is, I don't want to talk to you anymore, and you walk out. How do you politely?
Your phone vibrates.
Okay, so nowadays you can say, "Oh wait, what was that? Oh, I'm sorry. I've really got to call this person back." Right? Okay, fine. You can make up the excuse of there's something that's interrupted me, and now I've got to. It's in the old days, and people still wore watches. It was like, "Oh, is that the time? I have a meeting, right? I've got to get to right now. Very, very sorry. We can continue this conversation later." And then you make a beeline for the door. Right? You find a way to politely terminate a conversation. How do you finish a conversation with God? Well, don't we? I mean, we have tefillah, we have prayer, right? And whether you're praying 3 times a day or whether you're not, we see tefillah as being modeled around the idea of having a conversation with God. Right. Well, we stop that conversation at some point. How?
But amen.
All right, so
sometimes
it depends on where you are. If you are in a communal group, then you will still have your own private prayer, but the community, as Zerach points out, we have the Kaddish of different varieties, but Kaddish Shalem, if it's after an Amidah, which is a way of saying all the words in the world aren't going to do it, so let's just leave it where we are. Right? Every possible word, if I were to put it into what I wanted to say, wouldn't cover what I want to say. So we'll leave it here. Right? I've said enough because I can't say it all because there's no way to say everything to you, God. And that's sort of what the theme of the Kaddish is. But that only comes after the private prayer has finished.
Right.
Now, there's a custom of a leave-taking act of the end of the Amidah, which is you'll see people taking 3 steps back, right, head bowed, and they'll bow left, right, center, or right, left, center, depending upon custom. The idea being, this is how you would leave if you had a conversation with a king. Literally with a king, right? If you were actually standing in front of Napoleon, right, or Elizabeth II, you would back up from the king, right? You wouldn't just say, "See you, Your Majesty," and turn your back. You would back away because this was showing more respect and deference. You would bow. You'd have a humble posture. The idea of bowing to the sides was, of course, showing respect to the other people in the room, from which the monarch gains greater glory because, look, even this important person and that important person are only attendants to the king. So by bowing to them and then the king, you're showing the king's honor rests upon their honor, which makes the king even higher. And then you would exit. And that model then became part of Jewish prayer because when we're finishing our conversation with God, we shouldn't just say, "See ya, God," right? Later. But instead, we should leave with acts of reverence. Many of the people throughout the Tanakh have conversations with God.
Right.
How do they finish their conversations? Have you ever tried to pay attention to that?
The conclusion, you say amen.
Oh,
And that is a signal that it's not.
Well,
prayer is over, but not.
Right. That in prayer, when someone else has said a prayer and you want to say, "I agree with what you said," then we say amen. The idea that amen was the seal of your own prayer is actually not a Jewish concept. And in fact, in Judaism, we don't say amen to a prayer that you say. Right? If I say Berei Pri Hagafen, the prayer for drinking wine, I don't say the blessing and then finish with the word amen. I just say the blessing. The person next to me who wants to piggyback off my blessing or just wants to say, "You know what? I agree with what you said about God. God is amazing for making this fruit of the vine." They say amen to ratify what you have said. But in a conversation, there's no one to say amen to the conversations you just had. And how do you know when it's over? And how do you know when the conversation is done? Well, we're going to get to one of the most awkward conversations.
If the speaker decides to leave, then obviously they finish speaking to you.
If the person is gone, then there's nothing left to say. But it's not always clear who's leaving whom. in the different parts of the conversation. And we're going to deal with one of the most awkward conversations between somebody and God in the entire book of Genesis. It's the conversation between Abraham and God about Sodom and Gomorrah, about what's about to happen. Right? And the ending is what we're going to pay particular attention to, but see the structure of the argument and the conversation up to that point, because that will perhaps at least help you understand our commentaries about what the ending tells us. So we are on page 102, woo, triple digits, chapter 18, and we're going to start with verse 16. Because of the haggling, we've got a slightly longer section of Torah that I want us to read through. But we need all the haggle in order to really get a feel for it. Found it?
I found it.
Okay.
Yes. The men set out from there and looked down toward Sodom. Abraham walking with them to see them off.
All right. Now there's a whole long
angels who visited?
right. So there's a whole long conversation of exactly how this is meant to be played out. This is basically referring to the angels, the men who showed up at his tent and for whom he gave such great acts of hospitality. Exactly who they were: angels in the shape of people, people in the shape of angels also plus God plus angels. That's a whole nother discussion and conversation of who came to the party. But at this point, it seems like the angels' men are leaving, and Abraham is going to be left with God, and that therefore his conversation, which really began at the beginning of this whole parasha, right? God appeared to him near the terebinths of Mamre. That conversation of God and Abraham alone is now going to resume again. The whole episode with the angels was kind of a deviation from their one-to-one conversation, or it was part of a vision. Depends on how you want to interpret it. In any case, the conversation is going to turn back to just the two of them.
Now the Lord had said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Since Abraham is to become a great and populous nation, and all the nations of the earth are to bless themselves by him."
All right, so what is it that God's about to do?
Wow, something not good.
Destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, right? That's why we found out the destination of these people is they're heading towards Sodom as part of the cities on the plain. And God is saying, I'm about to push the old smite button. Abraham's going to know it was me. Don't I need to talk to him about this before it happens? Right? Because otherwise, Abraham's going to see it happen. He's going to know that it's my act. And maybe he won't understand. And even more to the point, he and his children will be responsible for doing justice, which is what I see what I'm about to do. They need to understand how I do justice so they can do justice. Right? If they see what I do and misunderstand it, they may misapply the lesson and think that it's being just. So we need to talk about this so that Abraham gets the right lesson.
For I have singled him out that he may instruct his children and his posterity to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is just and right, in order that the Lord may bring about for Abraham what the Lord has promised him.
Remember that you will be a blessing, you'll be populous, and you'll be wonderful and successful. Well, that's all going to come because of justice, but that's only going to work if they actually do justice, which means they have to understand God, which means this now incomprehensible act of destroying these cities may cause a problem if it's not made comprehensible. And the only way to make something comprehensible is to actually talk about it. And God
has to
is
make it comprehensible so that Abraham can teach his children the right way.
Exactly, which is why God is having a conversation, which I should point out is one of the other great insights that God is giving humanity here, which is if something's about to happen that you know is going to confuse other people, you should probably talk to them about it. Don't just assume they'll understand, but maybe, have a conversation for a while, people. So the number of TV shows that make their entire plot off of people not talking to each other, it's absolutely infuriating.
Oh, yes.
I know we would have no entertainment if people just had decent conversations. But funny enough, we have great stories here about decent conversations.
Then the Lord said, "The outrage of Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sins are so grave, I will go down to see whether they have acted altogether according to the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will take note."
All right, so what's the rather unusual little element of this?
That God doesn't know what they're doing.
Exactly. God's sending in an investigatory committee, right? God needs to send the private eyes to go down and inspect.
Check out.
Right? God doesn't know if the outcry that has reached him is true? Of course, God already knows. But who doesn't know?
Abraham.
Abraham,
Oh,
right? And the reader, right? We don't know exactly what their crimes are and whether they are truly guilty of this. And when it comes time for us to administer justice, we don't know without doing an investigation. So God is purposely modeling for us what an investigation into a horrible rumor might be in order that justice will be done, even though God does not need the investigation for God's self. Right? So this is God walking us by the hand as little children saying, this is how you do justice, right? When you hear your neighbor is murdering people and drinking their blood, you don't get the pitchforks and torches. You find out whether it's happening first, okay? Because you're going to be doing this on your own one day, little boy. You're going to grow up and you're going to have to be in charge of justice, and you are not allowed to just run off and attack people because you heard bad stuff about them. This is what we do. We find out if it's true, right? Repeat that word with me, boys and girls. True, right? So Mr. Rogers of justice. Okay.
The men went on from there to Sodom, while Abraham remained standing before the Lord.
All right, so now we're back to that one-on-one conversation.
Abraham came forward and said, will you sweep away the innocent along with the guilty? What if there should be 50 innocent within the city? Will you then wipe out the whole place and not forgive it, at least for the sake of the innocent 50 who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to bring death upon the innocent as well as the guilty, so that the innocent and the guilty fare alike. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly?
All right, the incredible conversation.
Yeah.
Now, there's a number of different ways to read this. One way to read this is simply of the existential confusion that Abraham is having at this notion of what's about to happen, that he's arguing with himself. Right? It's like, wait a minute, a whole city is being wiped out, but there must have been somebody innocent there. And if there was somebody innocent there, then wouldn't that mean that God was destroying the innocent just along with the guilty? And if that's so, then is that justice? Is it fair to kill the innocent together with the guilty? That can't be right, right? He's working through what justice could possibly mean.
Right.
And the other way of doing this, of course, is that this is his preamble, right? That he is saying, look, God, you've taught me that justice is that the guilty are punished and the innocent are not. And that's what I try to do, right? In my household, if there's a problem, I deal with the guilty person. I don't punish everyone. If there's a problem with my neighbors, I deal with the guilty people. I don't punish everyone, right? You go and you talk, you investigate, you work it out, right? There's all these things that Abraham models. And now if I see this, this doesn't seem like you, God, right? You're not the kind of person that would punish the innocent together with the guilty. So I don't understand, which is exactly why God wanted to have the conversation. Because you can see that if God had simply obliterated the cities and left Abraham to figure it out for himself, Abraham would have been absolutely perplexed at what had just happened, and it would have shaken his understanding of what God's justice was. And it would have either taught him that God isn't just, God forbid, or that justice means obliterating the innocent together with the guilty, which would also be very tragic when it came time for Abraham to be instituting justice or for his descendants to be carrying out justice. Okay, so now we get God's response.
Yeah, the Lord answered, okay, if I find within the city of Sodom 50 innocent ones, I will forgive the whole place for their sake.
Okay, so you know what? You've got a point. Again, this isn't like news to God, and God already knows that there aren't 50 people there, but God is working with Abraham, Socratic method, if you will, to try and get him through this process to truly understand how this is going to work.
Abraham spoke up saying, here I venture to speak to my Lord, I who am but dust and ashes. What if the 50 innocent should lack 5? Will you destroy the whole city for want of the 5?
Right? Think about, the way his mind is working. All right. God has said, yes, I'm not going to destroy a whole city, even if there are only 50 people. But once you ask the question of, well, will you destroy it if there are 50 innocent? And the answer is no. Then the next question is, what about 45? Right? It's where do you draw the line? How much of the evil of Sodom and Gomorrah do you allow to be perpetuated because you don't want to hurt the some number of innocent people? And then if you say, well, some number, what is that number? And that's what Abraham's trying to work through.
So the Lord answered, I will not destroy it if I find 45 there. But Abraham spoke to him again and said, what if 40 should be found there? And the Lord answered, I will not do it for the sake of the 40. And Abraham said, let not my Lord be angry if I go on, but what if 30 should be found there? And the Lord answered, I will not do it if I find 30 there. And Abraham said, I venture again to speak to my Lord. What if 20 should be found there? And the Lord answered, I will not destroy for the sake of the 20. And Abraham said, let my Lord not be angry if I speak this last time. What if 10 should be found there? And the Lord answered, I will not destroy for the sake of the 10. When the Lord had finished speaking to Abraham, he departed, and Abraham returned to his place.
Okay.
Is there a reason why he never mentioned Lot?
No. So first of all, it's not 100% clear that he knows that Lot is necessarily still living there. Secondly, it's not 100% clear that he knows that Lot is innocent, that Lot is a righteous person. And thirdly, he is probably trying to get them towards the point without saying, do it for my family, of saying, do it for the righteous, hoping that Lot plus his family would meet the minimum criteria, or at the very least would be able to be spared, right? Because that's the alternative. And there's a whole there's so many different levels on this. And like I said, we're going to pick something that's not what I'm about to say as our main focus. But why the negotiation? Why doesn't God just say, look, if I find 10, I won't kill them from the first line? Why does he let Abraham lead the conversation? Why doesn't he tell Abraham what his minimum number is? I mean, really, if Abraham had stopped at 20, would that have been the magic number? I mean, if God was prepared not to destroy the city for 10, was he only prepared to do so if Abraham came up with that on his own? Why let Abraham continue to act like he has some impact on the outcome when we know that God is going to do what God believes is right, regardless of what? I mean, if Abraham had kept his mouth shut, would God have destroyed the innocent?
In a way, he's making a disciple by agreeing to this whole conversation. Then we're clued into that at the opening. He's going to charge his children in the way of the Lord, and that's raising disciples,
right?
Which is done through questioning, inquiring,
Abraham,
curious mind,
right? Abraham
that's how you make it happen.
He has to be the active agent in this, right? He has to be the one that is discovering through this conversation and through his own reflection, which he may not have had up until this point, that collateral damage isn't good. Right? Even when you're trying to do something right, you need to minimize the number of innocent people that get hurt. And Abraham may have been coming to this realization in this process, and God had to give him time because, 50 people sounds like a lot. And then 45 sounds almost like 50. So, that still sounds like a lot. And then 40 and 30 and 20. And Abraham, by steps and step, is coming to the realization that even a small group of people would be worth not destroying the city. Which, of course, leads us to the question of why didn't Abraham said,
this is my
one, right? Because the answer wasn't, would you destroy the city for the sake of the innocent? The opposite wasn't, or will you let the innocent die? Ultimately, as we're going to see when the angels go to the city, it's the innocent get out. Right. At least, ideally, they leave. And, we have some problems with Lot and his family, but that's for another discussion. And ultimately, the goal would be that the innocent would leave. So if there's one innocent person, ideally, that person will get out and they will not be there when the catastrophe happens. But why then do we settle for 10? Because the idea is that you need at least 10 to be able to sustain themselves and be able to hold out against the badness of the city and ultimately perhaps even be able to influence. Remember, as we know from that magic number of 10 in the book of the Midbar of Numbers, it is the 10 bad spies that corrupt the opinion of the entire nation. Well, if 10 people can corrupt the opinion of an entire nation, 10 people can reform the opinion of an entire nation. Right? So those 10 people in Sodom, if they existed, they might be able to turn the whole city around. But if there aren't 10, that's not enough. There's no critical mass.
But also, I don't know in the Hebrew, does it say Abraham says, this is my last time. This is the last thing I'm going to ask.
He does.
He sets it up as being 10.
Abraham seems to settle on 10 and
He
says,
doesn't go.
one more, right? Let me just say it one more time.
Just, he doesn't go down to 5 or to,
God never tells him no,
right,
but then God also leaves,
right.
That's right.
right? So is God leaving, telling Abraham that the conversation is over? Remember what we began our discussion with. Or is God leaving because Abraham has indicated that the conversation is over because he said, I'm not going to talk to you, I'm not going to ask you anymore, right? Who terminated the conversation? Is God leaving because Abraham said he's done? Or is Abraham done because God leaves?
No, Abraham says, this is my last time. I'm going to, and then God says, I will not destroy for the sake of the 10 and leave.
And people have never, ever reneged when they said just one more thing.
Right, right.
God.
The last one.
No, I'm saying, I mean, if every episode, of Columbo finished with just one more thing and not the second, third, or fourth things that come next,
He
they would,
doesn't have a trench coat in the cigar.
yeah. So, yes, of course, God knew that Abraham was done, but did Abraham know that Abraham was done?
Yeah.
And did Abraham make the decision to finish this negotiation, or did God? Right. So
Yeah.
that's
Okay.
what I want us to sort of
Okay.
mull over here. So we're going to start off with, first of all, how do we get into this conversation, and what kind of conversation is this to begin with? So we're on the page that starts up with the phrase, we find the verb to come near, vayigash, which is how Abraham begins his conversation. It doesn't just say Abraham said to God. It says, and Abraham drew near, vayigash, which is a very powerful verb. It is, Abraham is literally stepping into the presence, which, by the way, I should also point out, just as I mentioned the stepping away from the presence of God when we finish our Amidah, at the beginning of the Amidah, it is also customary for many people to take steps into God's presence, right? To literally, vayigash, and he drew near to try and model that physically, so that emotionally and spiritually we have that experience. Okay, so we find the verb.
Yeah, we find the verb to come near used in the sense of coming near to wage war. That's in Samuel, where it says, so Joab drew near unto the battle.
Right, so vayigash can mean coming up to come to do battle, or
It can mean coming near to persuade by entreaty, by begging. And Judah came near to him and said, oh, my Lord.
which is, of course, when Judah is asking about Benjamin, saying, please, Mr. Crazy Vizier guy, actually Joseph, don't do anything to Benjamin. He also, vayigash, comes near, right? So we now have this word to mean prepare for battle and prepare to beg, right? Which seem a little contradictory.
And also of coming near to pray, as it says, and Elijah the prophet came near and said, oh, Lord, God of Abraham.
Right.
etc.
So it can mean to pray, it can mean to beg, and it can mean to do battle.
Wow.
That's an unusual verb. I mean, it's, not that strange that a verb might have multiple contexts when it's usable, but notice what Rashi, based off the Midrash, is going to do with this.
Yeah, he says Abraham used all these methods: to fight by speaking stern words, to persuade by entreaty, and to pray.
Right? So the first fight, right? Will the judge of all the world not do justice?
Yeah.
Right? That is them's fighting words, as we say,
Yeah.
right? That was a harsh statement to say to God. And it kind of worked. Said, no, of course, you're right. I will absolutely compromise on this. And then he goes on to be persuading, I am but dust and ash and all of the things. He begs that God would be more forgiving. And then he finishes off in his final one as, his, don't be angry if I speak for just one more time. How about 10 as a prayer to finish it off? So Abraham is going through all the different modes. The question then is, does that mean he has now exhausted his quiver? He's used every possible technique to move God on this point, and now he's done. So that means Abraham's done, which means conversation's over, right? If he's used every tool possible, what's left to be said? See you later. Okay, so that's one way of reading this. Sforno has a different understanding.
Ki Rabbah.
Yes.
Abraham felt that the way God had worded the decree with the words ki rabah, meaning for it is great, that what God might have meant was that as long as the majority of the people were guilty, this would justify eliminating the entire city, including the innocent. In that event, God would not be perceived as meting out justice.
All right, so Sforno is trying to key in on why would Abraham have ever thought God would be unjust? And the idea he has is that if we go back into chapter 18, a very great verse 20, right? For I have, heard that they have this sin, and it is so great, right? Ki rabbah. So rabbah can also just mean rove, right? Which can mean the majority of something. And so Sforno is taking that as being when God said to Abraham, I'm going to find out because I've heard it's great. He heard it as being, I'm going to go find out because I've heard it's the majority. And then Abraham's like, wait a minute, you're going to wipe out a whole city just because the majority of them are bad? Right? If 51% of the city's bad and 49% is good, you're going to really obliterate that? And so that is, according to Sforno, what triggers Abraham's need for a conversation, which, again, he seems to win in that first battle. All right, what about 50? Right? We know there's definitely more than 100 people in the town. So he's already starting off with a very low minority that could be worth saving. And then he takes it from there. But Sforno, again, is looking at this as being, God said something that worried, that alarmed Abraham. That's why he needed to speak out the way he did. And Sforno adds as well,
seeing that you are the judge of the whole earth, if you will judge people based on the conduct of the majority, you would eventually be forced to destroy mankind, seeing that most people everywhere are wicked.
All right, so Sforno's a little bit of a pessimist.
Yes, to say the least.
Yeah.
Which is basically him saying, wait a minute. If it really is the majority, if I don't get this clear, then, whatever happened with Noah is going to happen again. Because if you're just going to go by the majority, then at any one point, there may be 51% of the world that's bad. And that means goodbye world. Wait, we need to work this out, God. we need to get this straight. And of course, Abraham is thinking of that very much for himself and for his descendants, right? Because even if Abraham is going to be true to God, and even if his descendants will be true to God, it's unlikely that they will be the majority of the planet. Which means if we're true to you, God, and the other 80% of the world is wicked, you're going to wipe out the whole world, including me and my children and all of my descendants?
Right.
Well, what's the point? Right? If our continued existence and blessing is contingent entirely on there being a majority of the world being good, then we're doomed, at least potentially. Now, the Midrash and Talmud go on to say that this isn't actually the way it is, and we should never consider the majority of the world to be evil. We should consider instead the world to be exactly half and half, right? That the world is on a razor's edge, and one more deed by me will tip it one way or the other. That's how we should conceptualize the world's balance. We should never think the world is so good that it won't notice my sins, and we also shouldn't think the world is so bad that it won't notice my mitzvot, my good deeds, right? So we want to see it as being for motivational purposes right on the edge.
But since God created everything, why did he create people to be bad?
He didn't. He created the capacity for people to be bad.
Yeah.
God didn't create dynamite. God created the various molecules that, if used, could become dynamite. God created human beings so that we had the capacity to choose between good and bad. And then we choose wrong sometimes, and some people more often than others. And so that is what is now concerning, according to Sforno, right? Because Abraham is saying, look, I'm on the right path. I think I'm getting this whole relationship with God thing down, and the idolatry stuff is going, and we're going to be good and just and honest. And what do you mean it doesn't matter if I'm good, everyone else is going to be bad, and now we're all going to get wiped out? Wait, that's right. I didn't know that, there were additional terms and conditions that applied that are beyond my control, that you can feel this anxiety sinking in. And it's an anxiety that I think exists even to this day. There are many people who wonder, what's the point of doing philanthropy? What's the point of being altruistic? What's the point of helping any person around you? Because there are a bunch of other people out there that are just going to screw it up, right? So why should I bother being nice? I'll just go, I won't hurt anyone, but I'll go live in my own little bubble and ignore the rest of the world because the rest of the world is beyond saving. And that is not what Abraham is modeling for us, right? If you think the rest of the world's in trouble, you have to find a way to protect the innocent while also fixing the wicked. All right, onward, or else we'll never finish.
And the Lord went away. That means as soon as the counsel for the defense had nothing more to say, the judge took his departure.
Okay, so who stopped talking first? According to Abraham, exactly.
Abraham.
Right? Abraham is the advocate for defense. He is the one saying, don't kill them, don't kill them, don't kill them. When he stops talking, meaning when he runs out of arguments, then the judge isn't going to stay around any longer, right? The judge stays as long as the attorneys are arguing. And so therefore, Abraham finishes talking, and then verse 33, the Lord departs.
You said who spoke last? The Lord spoke last.
But Abraham
The
said,
Lord
"This is the last
literally spoke
Right,
last
right, okay.
and then left, right? God says, I agree with what you just said. The silence that comes after that is where Abraham could have said more. And when he didn't, God knew the conversation was done, which means God was waiting for Abraham to say perhaps more. Now, there was nothing more for Abraham to say. We don't necessarily want to go down the road of condemning him for this, although we could talk maybe another day about the spirituality of saving the individual, even in a wicked situation, and other ways in the retreat. But what Rashi, again, channeling the Midrash, is trying to say here is Abraham had exhausted himself, and God had recognized that. And therefore, the case was done, right? He
God
had,
actually responded. He said, I'm not going to destroy for 10.
for 10, exactly.
For 10.
But
Yeah.
Abraham didn't say, what about 5? Abraham didn't say, what about 3? Abraham didn't say, what about postponing it 10 years? The council had rested.
Yeah.
Right? He had made his final argument, and Rashi and the Midrash is taking it literally. When he said, just one more thing, he meant, this is my final argument. And when God accepted it, there was nothing else to say. Therefore, the judge departs. And therefore, what happens to the advocate?
Abraham returned to his place. That means the judge departed, the advocate went away,
That's Abraham.
but the prosecutor continued his accusation. And on that account, that's why the 2 angels came to Sodom to destroy it.
Which is chapter 19, right? So Rashi, in typical fashion, loving to find the juxtaposition of text, the Simchut Parshiot, of why are these 2 pieces together? He's saying, why does it go back immediately to those 2 guys going into the town of Sodom? It's because that's still the prosecution, right? The defense is rested. The prosecution is going to make the rest of its case. And boy, what a case does it have against Sodom, right? So it does help the rest of us realize just in a small excerpt how bad the people are that live there.
You don't want to be an angel.
You don't want to be anybody in Sodom. All right.
No.
All right. So Siftei Chachamim, which is a commentary on Rashi's commentary on the Torah, says this about Rashi.
Once the judge leaves, it says, the defender leaves. That is, the verse comes to teach us that God seeks out the defender's words because God does not desire death for the wicked. But when the defender fell silent, God left. Otherwise, why does it say here, he departed? Unlike all other prophecies, where this is not mentioned.
All right. So Siftei Chachamim is trying to say that what Rashi is saying, based on the Midrash, is that God is relieving reluctantly. Right? In all other visions and all other prophecies, God and the prophet talk, and then it just stops. It never says, and God left. The fact that this one says God left is the equivalent of somebody saying, well, I guess if there's nothing else to talk about and we're done here, unless anyone has anything else to say, then I guess we're done. It's by saying God departed, it's almost as God is slow walking out the door, waiting for one more thing that Abraham might throw in as a last minute, dare I say it, Hail Mary, to try and maybe get a little extra help for his case. But God is doing that precisely so that we understand God does not want to punish the wicked. God does not want to destroy the wicked. God wants the wicked to be fixed. And that's as far as we were able to get, because again, ultimately this number 10 comes down to our understanding of what is at least a nucleus that can become a sanctuary that can make fixing happen around it. Yeah?
Okay, I can see what he's saying there, but it does say that the 2 angels went on.
Mm-hmm.
There's still, the conversation between Abraham and God are taking place, it hasn't, but the two angels who are being sent to
Mhm.
destroy are still going on,
So are they being sent to destroy?
or to investigate.
Right. They're to investigate and then precipitate the destruction. If it is, in quote, found to be
Knowing what's
true.
gonna happen.
Right. But ultimately, really, the job of one of those angels is to save Lot and his family.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, that does turn out.
So, and so the whole discussion
Okay, I'm
of
sorry.
what angels showed up and which job did each one of them have, one to announce the coming of Isaac, one to save Lot, and one to destroy, is a whole nother midrashic thread, but not a thread we're going to pull today.
Yeah, because if God says, I won't destroy it if there are 10, somebody has to find the 10.
Well, yeah. And someone also would have to tell the angels that we're down there investigating.
Right.
Wait, guys, if they're 10, we don't need to.
Yeah, somebody-
But you're concerned that there seems to be a parallel conversation that God's already sent off the killers while Abraham is pleading for mercy.
Right.
Then isn't the deal already done? And apparently, no, the deal is not done. Right? It's not done until the destruction happens.
Until it's done.
Okay. All right. Now, we have this interesting little appendage at the end of verse 33 where it says Abraham returned, right? Limkomo, to his place.
Right.
What is his place? Right? This is such a laden term in biblical Hebrew of hamakom, the place, that obviously the commentators have to weigh in. So we've got a good summary of multiple interpretations of this, to his place.
So one may also understand the words to his place, meaning to his customary behavior of entertaining visitors and guests. Having fulfilled this mitzvah in respect of the angels who had now departed, Abraham went back to his tent to look for other visitors to entertain, because this was Abraham's central virtue. Whenever he was able to practice it, he's described as being in his element. That means in his place.
Right. So what is his place? His place is being the concierge of the hotel, right? To be the most hospitable, helpful person that you could possibly imagine. Now, that is also a very interesting thing to bring here, because you might have thought, if you were Sforno, that with this idea that maybe the majority of the world is evil, what's the point of being hospitable? Doesn't that mean the majority of the people who are going to come to my tent are going to be bad people? Why should I open my door and be hospitable if most people are bad?
But what if 1 in
Because
10
you
is
fear
good?
God.
Because what if one
What
of
if
them?
1 in 10 is good?
What if 1 in 10
One
is good?
or you fear God. You know God is.
Or you respect God's
You
teachings?
respect
right?
God's teaching, and you know that God ultimately is your protector.
And there's also this great line in one of the midrashes, which is when Abraham is complaining about these idol worshipers who come to his tent, God says, I've put up with him his whole life. You can't put up with him for one lunch. Right? It's God is
Even if he
patient.
wants extra
So
towels.
we are told to be patient too, right? God is holding off on judgment. We hold off on judgment too.
Right.
God does not predicate the hospitality he extends to humanity by giving them the world to live in just because they're not good yet. Why should you withhold the hospitality because the person is not good yet? Now,
Yeah, it means
makes-
that people have the potential,
Mm-hmm.
even the person who is, in quote, evil or
Right.
bad,
or has done some bad
or
things.
some, has the potential to be turned.
Right,
And
exactly.
And there's through his kindness that he leads many to repentance.
Exactly right. Because they're going to need that model in order to change. Right? They can't all be Abraham and just figure it out on their own. Some people need Abraham to help them figure it out. And there's one other little irony that's going to happen here, which is if this destruction is about to happen, guess who a lot of the travelers are going to be in the very near future? Refugees. Right? People who lived on the outskirts of these areas that were not maybe in the city, but were near the cities when they were obliterated and all turned into this wasteland. They're all now going to be dislocated. They're all going to have to leave. And some of them are going to end up in Abraham's tent.
Right.
Right? So it's him going back to his place is not totally neutral. Him going back to his place is absolutely still connected to this whole discussion that he's just had with God. And his preparedness, his willingness to go back and do his job as a host, despite the fact that a lot of people in the world are bad, and despite even some of them clearly bad people are going to show up in his doorstep that had just escaped this horrible punishment because they lived outside the zip code, he is still willing to be hospitable. He's still willing to sit in his open door and greet them. All right, but there's another way of understanding that.
Another way to explain went to his place is to his regular emotional state. As long as Abraham had been in a dialogue with God, he was on a totally spiritual and intellectual level, not allowing for normal emotional responses, which are part of the human condition. Now that the immediate benevolent presence of God had departed, he resumed his customary frame of mind and his approach to matters of a more terrestrial, earthly nature.
Right. So this happens, or at least potentially can happen, when you engage in tefillah, even to this day, and even if you're not Abraham, right? When you are engaged in prayer, when you are focused wholly on these concepts and this aspiration of being worthy of being in God's presence, it puts you in an entirely different mindset, an entirely different emotional state. And when you finish, you definitely bring some of that with you, but you also have to go take care of the clogged toilet, and you have to take care of bills, and you have to take care of all the other stuff. The terrestrial problems are still there. And you can't live entirely in that moment of transcendental vision with God. And also, God forbid, you should live entirely in the world of clogged toilets. Right? We travel back and forth. Right? That is one of our unique blessings as human beings. But he goes back to his human place. Onward, Kabbalistic
Approach to his place is that the verse is a reference to the attribute of chesed, loving kindness. Seeing that attribute had failed to find within Sodom any deserving individuals who would enable it to become active on behalf of the town they lived in, this attribute now returned to its former place and left the field to the attribute of justice.
All right, so Abraham is very often seen in Kabbalistic literature as representing the attribute of chesed, the attribute of kindness. Like he's like the personification, if you will, of this attribute of God. So when Abraham returns to his place, it's like chesed itself has said, all right, I've done everything I can. And apparently, even with the largest amount of loving kindness possibly able to be extended to these people, they come up short. All right, I've given them every possible consideration, and they're not. So what's left? Din. What's left is justice. And it will now be in charge. And he has a proof for why that is.
Because this is the mystical aspect of the words, the two messengers, that is angels, arrived in Sodom. Shortly afterward, the Torah writes, when Elohim destroyed the towns in the valley, etc.
Specifically using the term Elohim rather than the word Adonai, right? Those are the two most common names of God. And Elohim is considered to be aligned with the concept of justice. And Adonai is considered to be more aligned with the concept of chesed, of kindness. And you can read much into the text when there's a decision of whether or not the author is referred to by Adonai or whether the author is referred to as Elohim. And in the destruction, the term Elohim is the one that is used.
And
go ahead.
That's why we see the other term Adonai departing.
Right.
That's when the chesed leaves.
Right. Adonai departs, chesed comes. Adonai departs, chesed departs, judgment sits down.
All we have left.
Yeah.
But this attribute of justice is not allowed to operate until it has received the authority to do so from the attribute of mercy, of chesed.
Right. So mercy takes priority. Right? And we know that because God is patient with all of us. Every time we mess up, God doesn't just throw a lightning bolt at us. So mercy is default. And once mercy has been exhausted in defending us, then justice.
In chapter 19, we find for the first time since Abraham had begun to plead, the first time the name of God used by the Torah is the name representing the attribute of justice.
Right. So we go all the way from this section in chapter 18 where Abraham and God are having this conversation, all the way to chapter 19, verse 29, where Elohim finally comes out. The sword is unsheathed.
At this point in the story, the attribute of justice became active against people concerning whom the die had already been cast.
Right. Eventually, there is a certain point where the consequences of a particularly bad acts do catch up. Right? Mercy will hold punishment at bay for a very long time, but when it is this intense and this massive a scale, eventually it will catch up to it. Right? We don't always know when, we don't always know how, but eventually, yes, the world will balance itself against evil of this magnitude. All right. Now, Sforno again is going to come back to tell us more about Avram.
Abraham remained in a waiting posture. He had not given up hope to expect further prophetic insights until it became clear to him that God's presence had departed.
Okay, so what is Sephorno saying here is that it was God who cut the conversation off, not Avraham. Right? Avraham made his last bid, and then he waited. Sorry for the platypus. Waited to see whether there was going to be more, whether the vision would go on. But then God left. And when God left, then Avraham departed and went back to his place. So this wasn't that Avraham broke off. It was God said, we're done. And this is very different than another very famous place where the conversation ends.
Yeah, we can't help noticing the contrast with Genesis chapter 4, where the Torah reports the termination of God speaking to Cain, they report it as, and Cain left from before the Lord. Cain ended the interview with God by his being the first one to leave, while the presence of God had not yet departed.
All right, so Cain storms off like a petulant teenager, which he wasn't a teenager, but he was definitely petulant, and basically says, "Meh," when God is trying to explain to him, how the world works. Here we see Abraham doing the opposite. God is explaining to him how the works, and Abraham is actively engaging and questioning and trying to plumb it and work it out. Eventually doesn't have anything else left to say, but he still waits to hear if there's more. Right? Whether or not maybe God will explain something additional. Maybe God will point something out. Maybe I'll think of something else. He waits until it is clear from God that this phase of his education, this phase of his vision is done. And that is that ultimate point of preparedness and acceptance of ultimately it is God that is dictating the conversation, even as we play our part to the best of our extent. And Abraham's patience and humility here, his persistence is, I think it's the way Forno tries to capture that as opposed to Cain is beautiful. And now we're going to finish with Or HaChaim.
The Torah reports that God did not even give Abraham a chance to plead further on behalf of a lesser number of righteous people.
All right, so he is going to take the opinion, which is not the one we've been going with most of our commentators, that Abraham said one more time, and God said, I don't care if he wants to do a second one more time, we're done, right? That it was God that cut off the conversation, not that God waited to see if the defender would have anything else to say, but God said, we're done here.
After all, Abraham had said he had used his final plea.
Mm-hmm. And God basically said, it will be your final plea. Even if you might have thought of something while making your final plea that you wanted to add, we're done.
Although the Zohar suggests that the righteous is the foundation of the earth, that means a single righteous person could save the rest of the world. This may only apply to an outstanding tzaddik.
Right. So, of course, they have the question that we all had, which was, why didn't Abraham argue down to one?
Yeah.
Right. Why didn't he try and get God down to, if there's one righteous person, then will you destroy the city? And the argument from the Zohar is, well, maybe only if the most outstanding of tzaddik was there, then yes, maybe God would have spared it. But you couldn't count on there being like a super tzaddik down in the land of Sodom. I mean, certainly we knew Lot was not a super tzaddik, even if he was by some measures a righteous person, which is, we measure by the balance of a person's life, not by a few mistakes. We wouldn't call him a super tzaddik, but then that forces us to ask the other question.
Perhaps if Abraham had lived in Sodom, his presence would have been enough to save the town.
Why didn't Abraham move? If Abraham really didn't want God to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, why didn't Abraham go to Sodom and Gomorrah and dare God to destroy the town with him
Did
in it?
Abraham see himself as such a wonderful, righteous person that he could save the whole place?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so the humility of Abraham plays against that scenario. But on the other hand, Abraham did know that he had a covenant with God, that he would make his children and descendants great, and that there would be a blessing and all of that. That can't happen if he's dead. Right? So could Abraham have used himself as a human shield? Right? Would he have been able to save the entire town? And the answer there is maybe. Right? That's what we've been saying, maybe. Right? Maybe God wouldn't have destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah on behalf of Abraham. But on the other hand, would that have changed Sodom and Gomorrah? Right? If Abraham had stood there and said, don't worry, I'll hold God back. Do we think the people of Sodom and Gomorrah would have said, oh, now, thank you. Now we're going to change what we're doing. Or would they have said, okay, you've got that. We've got some murder to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the problem is with even one super tzaddik holding back the destruction, even if that were possible, and even if Abraham had thought himself able to do that, he would have just been one guy standing there while everyone else went about the business not changing, continuing to be bad, continuing to be evil in all the horrible ways that we've talked about last week. So it wouldn't have actually rescued the town. Right? This town, these towns were unfortunately so saturated and so gone from righteousness that not only could you not find 10 righteous people of normal quality, but even if you'd shoved one great righteous person in there, it wouldn't have been able to make the difference. It wouldn't have changed their behavior. It might have delayed the punishment, but it wouldn't have actually transformed them. And ultimately, the Torah is telling us that it's about transformation. That is what is the purpose of the Torah and the purpose of the world. Right? The purpose is for transformation, for humans to actually grow and become better. And for that to work, there has to be the right situation, the right circumstances. Now, there is one very silver lining, piece of solace that we can take from all of this, which is nowhere else does God obliterate entire cities like this and not leave any remnant behind. God doesn't do that, which means ever since then, nothing else has been as bad as these places. Right? So no matter how bad you may think your town is, and I don't think Orlando's all that bad, but if you live in a place that you don't happen to like, or how bad you think, some city, Las Vegas, and what, it ain't that bad. Right? And there are, plenty of more than 10 innocent people in those places, which means even the worst places in the world have the chance to become better. Right? Even the worst places in the world have somewhere within their boundaries good people that are trying to make it a better place. And God is willing to be patient with them. And God is willing to help and strengthen them. And we too should make sure that we're willing to partner and help and strengthen any, and no matter how bad a place they live, to help make that place better. Because it's the righteous people that choose to make the world a better place that make the world not get obliterated.
I was going to say, when you talk about Sodom and Gomorrah, and you think of the Dead Sea, and I think many of us have been to Israel,
Or at least seen the pictures.
or have seen the pictures. It's hard to believe that there was a time when that was the golden fields, and that those were the
Lovely
the
place.
grazing lands and the beautiful, surroundings. Because you look at it today, even with chemical companies at one end of the Dead Sea, and you realize, does a blade of grass even know how to grow here? I mean,
Not so much.
it is really a sign of ultimate destruction.
And the fact that there aren't more places like that this is an almost singular place on the surface of the earth, that life is found almost everywhere else, is a sign that there is hope everywhere else. And there has been hope ever since, right? That we are better than they were, and that we have the capacity to keep getting better and better. And with that, hopefully, message of hope, we'll finish.
Do they really, some of these people drink blood, human blood?
Just a second.